Walter Isaacson, you've got a new book coming out this fall. What's it about?
It's about the innovators. We talk a lot about innovation these days. The word has almost become so devoid of meaning because it gets overused. I wanted to look at how real people invented the computer and the internet and how innovation really happened in the digital age. It was something that came out of working with Steve Jobs and before that Bill Gates to say who made that type of person, how did they end up being successful? And so the book is not just about singular people, but about teams, about collaboration. Because one of the things I discovered in doing this book is that real innovation comes from great teams, not just from great leaders.
What surprised you? What did you learn that surprised you?
The importance of connecting the arts to technology. The importance of what Steve Jobs always talked about, the liberal arts and the engineering intersecting. It begins with Ada Lovelace, whose father was the great poet, Lord Byron. And she loved poetry, but her mother wanted to be a mathematician, so she became a great mathematician. By the end, she is able to combine the notion of poetry and the notion of math, and she comes up with the idea of a computer program. She's the first person to understand that these calculating machines that do numbers will also be able to weave patterns and looms. They'll also be able to do words or music. And so the notion of the modern computer comes from this idea, which really begins with Ada Lovelace, of connecting sort of the arts to the technology.
When we think of early computers in the US, we think of ENIAC.
ENIAC was a great computer and was really the first programmable, all-digital computer. One of the interesting things is at the same time in Iowa, there was this lone professor doing a computer, John Atanasoff. He was doing it in the basement of the physics building. And in some ways he's the first, but he doesn't have a team around him. Unlike the ENIAC folks who have this whole team at the University of Pennsylvania. And so he could never get his computer really fully working, never get it developed, and it ends up being abandoned. So it's yet another example of the importance of teamwork. And that's where the ENIAC is so successful.
So Walter Isaacson, when this book comes out in the fall and you're asked, who invented the computer?
You'd have to say the people who created ENIAC were probably the first to do a programmable electronic computer. And they did it working in teams, but John Markley, who was one of the leaders of that team, even goes to Iowa and takes ideas from there. He goes up to Harvard and sees the computing machine that a guy named Howard Aiken had made there. And so what he does is he collects ideas like a bumblebee collects pollen and fertilizes it in various places and then brings it all together. That, as I was saying earlier, is how innovation really works. It's not some guy sitting in a garage all alone or a garret where a light bulb comes off on his head. You gather ideas from many places, you pull together a team and say, okay, we're going to execute on it now. So if I were to give credit for the invention of the computer, it'd be the people who did ENIAC, even though they took their ideas from a lot of other people, or I should say, especially because they took their ideas from a lot of other people.
Who's Steve Wozniak?
Wozniak was Steve Jobs' partner, in the founding of Apple. And once again, it shows how partnership and teamwork should work. Because Wozniak creates the circuit board for what becomes the Apple I and then the Apple II. He's an absolute genius at knowing how to create circuits with very few components in order to turn it into a hobbyist computer, the type of computer you can use at home. He loves giving it away. He's part of that old hacker ethos. He takes a sheet of how it works out, the schematic sheet, and gives it away to all the members of the homebrew computer club so they can build one. But what happens is his friend from just down the street, Steve Jobs, says, no, we should build these and we should sell them. And so they create a little company, which they call Apple. So what it takes to innovate is not just the person who has the idea, which is Wozniak. It also takes a person who says, how are we going to execute? How are we going to turn this into a commercial machine, which is what Steve Jobs did? How are we going to put a beautiful case around it? How are we going to get a power supply? How are we going to gather it all together? So the greatest teams, whether it's the people inventing the transistor, the microchip, the personal computer like Steve Jobs and Wozniak, usually have sort of a visionary engineering type, but also a hard-nosed business type, and that team pulls together and creates things like Apple or Intel.
Walter Isaacson, in putting the innovators together, you crowdsourced this book a little bit.
You know, the internet was invented in order to allow people to collaborate on their research. That was the original ARPANET done by the Defense Department, and then the internet, which is if you're at a research center and you want people at different research centers far away to help you shape your work, we'll have this internet so that, you know, we can share things. So I thought one night, well, why don't I see if it still works that way? So I took some of the chapters of my book and early drafts of them, very early drafts, and I just put them online for everybody to read. As a comment, tell me what, and oddly enough, some of the people, I got 18,000 comments in the first week for one chapter. And a lot of it led to some good stuff, like Stuart Brand, one of the great, wonderful, colorful characters in this book. Stuart Brand was a guy who invented the Whole Earth Catalog, the Well, which is one of the early online services. He invented he helped do the mother of all demos, which is when this guy Doug Engelbart shows a computer system for the first time. You know, he was there at the creation of so many different things. He was with Ken Kesey in the electric Kool-Aid acid tests that where they were dropping acid back then. So he's been involved in so many things. And he read my whole chapter and he said, here's who was there. Here's who was at the Homebrew Computer Club meeting. Here's what we did when we started the Well. He puts all these notes on it. And then other people say, well, I was actually at the first Homebrew meeting and it was more like these type of people. So it's like Wikipedia. The wisdom of the crowd helps to crowdsource it. And so I put a lot of that in the book and obviously gave them credit and said, here's what Stuart Brand said when he read an early version of this chapter.
Is it tough to write a book like this when we're in the middle of what is a continual innovation period?
No, because there's a wonderful arc, a wonderful trajectory, where there are a couple of big old themes. Theme one, as I said, is that really creative people who understand beauty and the arts and liberal arts and the humanities connect their imagination to the machines and the technology and the engineering. That's happened with Ada Lovelace in the 1830s. It's what Larry Page and Sergey Brin did in creating Google. So I want to show that narrative arc. Secondly, another theme is that technology is used to bring people together. It's a social networking tool. Sometimes you invent something like the personal computer and it becomes like a little thing you do in your basement or in your house. But soon we create networks and social networks to bring our computers together. So that's a theme that continues as well. So one of the things about this book is things that you thought were totally new, they're actually part of a wonderful progress of a lot of people coming up with ideas.
Were you working or keeping notes for this book as you were working on the Jobs book?
Yeah, I started this book actually 10 years ago. People say, how'd you write it so fast? 10 years ago, I was trying to write a book on how the internet came to be. All these unknown people who helped pull it together. And when I was working with Steve Jobs, he said, that's interesting, but what's more interesting is in the 1970s and the 80s, the internet came together at the exact same time personal computers came together. So you should make it a book about the joint connection of computers and networks. And so I changed the thrust of the book. And Bill Gates said that too when I was interviewing Gates. He said, that's fine, but networks are only half the story. It's networks and computers together that make the world magical. So I had been working on this, as I say, 10, 12 years, been keeping notes, been trying to write this, but by talking to Bill Gates a lot, by doing the book on Steve Jobs, it expanded the nature of what I was trying to do.
Where does Bill Gates fit into this narrative?
There's I think to me, fascinating chapter. I spent a lot of time with him. He invents something that's pretty interesting, which is the notion that software matters. That it's not going to be IBM, Compaq, Hewlett-Packard, who makes the hardware. What's really going to count is who makes the operating system, who makes the software. So when the first personal computer, the Altair, appears on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, and he's at Harvard as a sophomore, and his friend Paul Allen buys a copy of the magazine, runs to his dorm room and says, it's happening without us. They decide, no, we're not going to build a computer. We're going to build the operating system for this computer. They first do BASIC, which is just a programming language, but then by the time these computers are coming along, they create what's called DOS, the disk operating system.